I mean, from the time I was about 4 years old, I was surrounded by wrestlers, and they were all working out in the basement in those days, in the actual dungeon, and actually shooting down in the dungeon and wrestling for all they were worth back in those days. And my dad used to, funny enough, used to make beer in the next room, and it was kind of a drunken free-for-all every weekend, where the wrestlers would be, wrestling on the mat and drinking beer and lifting weights, and I'd just be a little kid sort of wandering around through the legs of these big giant wrestlers back in, I'd be about 1959, 60. And, growing up, from the time I was about 4 years old, 5 years old maybe, I got to watch up close, because I used to sit at the timekeeper table. But I got to watch some of the real great wrestlers of those days, like Buddy Rogers. I watched stillThe. I watched Pat O'Connor. I watched all the guys that in the years ahead became world champions, and even Gorgeous George. I think I watched in as a kid, and it gave me a great because I got to watch the wrestling from up close. I got to really study wrestling, and I was one of those kind of guys that, kids that, I kind of graded wrestlers even in those days, and I always thought wrestlers that went for a drop kick and the guy took a big fall without, like when he got missed by this much, to me they got to fail. They were like lousy wrestlers. And I was very critical as a kid growing up of good wrestlers and bad wrestlers, and I think those kind of things are what defined me later on as a wrestler. But as a kid, I just was really fortunate that I had such a good opportunity to really study so many of these great wrestlers that were working in those days. And a lot of those great wrestlers, and even over here in the UK, were just as good as the wrestlers today. They were great showmen, and lots of varying styles. And the beauty of working for my father, for most of my career, early part of my career anyway, was that Calgary, where we were based in, or we had like Japanese wrestlers that were quite good from Japan, that were very technical wrestlers. Of course, they couldn't speak any English. And same with, we used to get a lot of Puerto Rican wrestlers. And we used to get wrestlers pretty much from all over the world. We had, even back in those days, we used to get a lot of the wrestlers from the UK, some of the great wrestlers that worked over here, like Billy Robinson and Les Thornton. Were all guys that started for my dad in Calgary. And as a kid, they brought over the English-style wrestling with lifters and, fancy moves and rolls and flips, and which wasn't necessarily my style, but I sure learned a lot from a lot of those English wrestlers that came over. And sometimes you just would pick one or two little moves that they did and sort of make them your own. And over my career, things like Russian suplexes and just a lot of the moves I did, I picked up from a lot of the English wrestlers and a lot of the Japanese wrestlers and the Puerto Rican wrestlers. I learned how to make fire, they call it in wrestling, where you get to explode and make a big comeback on your opponent. And the best place to go learn that kind of stuff was Puerto Rico, and Puerto Rican wrestlers were very fiery and exciting kind of guys to watch. And anyway, I was really lucky to study a lot of these great kind of wrestlers, and as a kid, different styles. And when I got into the business, I never expected to get in the wrestling business. I kind of changed my mind about it when I was about 12 or 13. It wasn't my dad didn't have as many good wrestlers working for him in that time period. I'd say from the time I was about 12 to maybe, 17, 18, I disengaged and kind of lost faith in wrestling a little bit, because a lot of the wrestlers working for my dad in, say, mid-70s were all very repetitious. They all kind of copied each other, and they were all sort of cheap imitations of another wrestler that had come down the road another time. But then nobody was very original, at least for me back in the 70s. And I kind of became disenchanted with pro wrestling, and I was sort of mired in an amateur wrestling career, which was a great. I was really happy to be not happy. Happy's not the right word. I was very satisfied with my amateur wrestling skills and what amateur wrestling gave me. It gave me a really good basis for what I would use as my framework for being a pro wrestler. I've always thought that the best wrestling needs to at least pretend to be real, and that's what I always tried to bring to the ring all the time. I always tried to make it as absolutely as real as possible. I just always wanted people to believe as much as possible, so that when they went home that night, they thought, that was a good match. That one kind of took me away and made me for a few minutes. I don't think anyone, well, maybe, I don't know how much people believe wrestling was real or is real, but it was important to me to at least try my best to at least suspend your disbelief, where you go, maybe. Owen used to always joke and go, the first 2 matches were fake, but the last 7 were real, kind of thing. And or he used to tell fans when they used to ask him, how much of that stuff's fake? And Owen would say, like, 61% is fake, but the other 39 is real. And it's kind of funny how it's hard to tell sometimes. And as a kid watching wrestling, it was hard to tell. And I just know that I think I always tried to bring that kind of realism to the ring when I wrestled. And my father, I think, kind of brought that kind of wrestling to the world. He made the wrestling, I think, that my dad put on in the 50s and the 60s was better wrestling than they were doing anywhere else in North America.
Can I politely interject? Indeed, you're allowing me to. You've already mentioned how you were enjoying, perhaps to a certain extent, your amateur life in your early days. And your father actually wanted you to go and win a gold medal in the Olympics or the Commonwealth Games, didn't he?
Yeah, it was a big thing to him that he didn't want me to turn into a pro wrestler just yet. I think he thought you could do that down the road. But the first thing you got to do is accomplish yourself in amateur wrestling. And I was high school and a provincial champion, and I was college champ in 1977. There's a lot of people should know that I didn't start wrestling till 1979 professionally. A lot of books and magazines always got me starting in 1974 or 75 and things like that. And I was, about 16 years old in high school back then. Anything but a pro wrestling career. But I think that my dad, he put it to me one time. He said, don't you want to walk down the street someday and be wearing the gold medal from the Olympics or the Commonwealth Games and have everybody walking down the street going, hey, there's the world champ, or there's the gold medal winner in wrestling. And I told my dad, I said, I'd much rather drive down the road in a Cadillac and honk my horn at the guy that's walking on the sidewalk and just got the gold medal. And of course my dad didn't find that very funny, but it was a true conversation, and it tells you a lot about why I wanted to get out of amateur wrestling and into pro wrestling. I mean, I love what amateur wrestling did for me, but it was just tough trying to make weight classes and things like that all the time. I was about 20 years old and trying to get big instead of trying to get small, and trying to make weight classes and lean up and stuff was kind of like the last thing I wanted to do. I wanted to just bulk up and get big and start to aim myself at the pro wrestling career that I never wanted. But I did well in wrestling as a teenager before I became pro, but I realized somewhere about when I was about 18 or 19 that I wasn't as sick of pro wrestling as I thought I was, and started to think differently about getting into it. And I think what I always wanted to do was be different or be better than the other wrestlers, and like anybody else. I wanted to, like when I used to watch the wrestlers back that worked for my dad in those days, I always thought that I could be better than those guys and that were in the ring. And when I finally did become a wrestler, right from the very start, I tried to be different than everyone else that had ever come down the road back then.
You mentioned the dungeon, and it's occurred to me that your mum and dad, they had 12 kids, they had their own brand of wrestling in the dungeon when nobody else was watching. But but you mentioned going pro, and if I just say the Hart Foundation, Jimmy Hart, Jim Neidhart, that's really where, I suppose, for you professionally, that's where it really took off?
Well, kind of. You know, the Stampede wrestling that I did working for my dad, got more, it was in a lot of ways really interesting, and was by defining kind of thing for me, where I just, you know, when I first got into the business, one of the guys I had one of my first matches with, I think I had my second or third professional match of my career, was with a guy called the Dynamite Kid from Warrington. And we didn't like each other very much. I thought he was a pretty cocky, kind of funny little guy that had a weird personality. And he didn't like me at all. I think my brother Bruce kind of talked him into disliking me a lot, and, for whatever reasons. But we didn't see eye to eye right off the bat, and I think one of the first matches, that first match I ever had with him, he purposely broke my nose and took a lot of cheap shots at me in the ring, and I was pretty naive and didn't know what, you know, I didn't know what I did wrong or what happened, but I had a very full first match with the Dynamite Kid, where he clearly didn't like me, and I understood it. And I remember when the match was over, I thought, you know, this guy's took a lot of cheap shots, and I was pretty ticked off at him. But at the same time, I had a lot of respect for him too, because he was just a little guy that was trying to keep his job and trying to prove a point to, I think, the other bigger wrestlers. But in saying that, the funny thing is, the next day I got home from that very same trip, and my two brothers, Smith was the oldest and Bruce was my second oldest brother. They were both supposed to be going to Puerto Rico, and they had 2 airplane tickets, one for S. Hart and one for B. Hart. And my brother Bruce totally chickened out and didn't want to go at the last minute. And so my brothers came knocking on my door and said, "Hey, we got this idea. You know, you can go down to Puerto Rico with Smith and take Bruce's place and become a full-time, like, you'll have a job, and you'll be on the circuit, and you'll get plenty of work." And it was really strange, because it was right out of nowhere, and all of a sudden, next minute I was on an airplane flying to Puerto Rico, and that was a really strange place for wrestling. I've never seen anything like it in my life. There was, I think the very first night I got in there, I hurt myself really bad. I slipped on trying to throw a drop kick, and I slipped up and landed right on my right shoulder here and dislocated it. And I remember being in the dressing room after that. It was like my very first night in, and I remember they told me they needed me for a run-in on the last match. And I told myself I had ice pack on my shoulder with like a little plastic bag that I got from they sell pop and stuff like that. They gave me a little bag of ice that leaked everywhere. And I remember I said I got a bad shoulder, and they said, "Don't worry about it. You just got to run in and pull them apart," which is like, give me a break. You know, with a bad shoulder, I can't pull anybody apart. But I had to basically run into the last match with my brother Smith and be part of a pull apart. And I can remember it was a big stadium with, instead of glass around the arena like you see in a hockey arena, it was caged, just like a big giant cage match. It was like a fenced cage. And in the ring there was 4 wrestlers. All of them were covered in blood everywhere, and the 2 villains in the match were beating one of the wrestlers merciless with a chain, and it was a pretty violent, gory kind of match. And I remember starting to walk to the ring, and it was a full-blown riot with the fans. Every fan, it was about maybe 20,000 people, and they were all throwing chairs. It was raining chairs, and they were flying in every direction. And I remember I stopped and leaned against the fence, and I said, I'm not going anywhere near that ring. Forget it. And I watched from a distance, and it was the craziest thing I've ever seen in my life, where the wrestlers, I remember the two villains in the match ran past me like stampeding, like running for their lives. They ran past, and there's fans and police fighting with chairs and knocking each other out. And it was like a knockdown drag out between the fans, the wrestlers, security, and police. And I'll never forget watching one guy who was an American guy, I think from Florida or something, but he was definitely an American tourist. He had like his blonde-haired girlfriend, and they were holding hands, and she had a nice flowery dress on, and he had like Bermuda shorts and a sort of a flowery shirt. He was watching this wrestling, and he had his back to the ring, and the referee was coming from behind, walking towards him, and he was taking the chair and he was swinging it as wide as he could to keep all the fans away from him, who were all trying to kill him for real with knives and things like that. And he was a Puerto Rican referee named Hammer, and he was fighting for his life for real. And he was backing up towards this couple, and I remember the couple, the woman was facing the other way, and the man was facing the other way. And I could see it happening, and I actually started to run to the ring to see if I could save him from being clobbered. I knew I was going to be late. I couldn't run that fast, and I wouldn't get there in time. And I remember I stopped, and I watched him, the referee, turn around and just lambaste this guy in the head, knock him completely out cold. And I remember the girlfriend was standing there holding his hand still, and she's watching all the stuff, and I remember her turning around and looking, and like she couldn't believe he was out cold. That was my first night in Puerto Rico, and I learned a lot down there. Probably learned a lot of things like what not to do or what I would do different in wrestling, but I did learn a lot of things, and I came home from there and started working for my father, and my whole career started right then and there, I think.
You mentioned the crowd, and we see on there that people have watched you over your career and still watch the WWE wrestling, and the massive crowds that they attract. But was there a better or even bigger crowd than that famous day at Wembley in 82? How many were there, by the way? Yeah, you look old enough, as though you were there. You were still middle-aged then, weren't you? Good. One or two people there, yeah.
Well, Wembley was, I think that was one of my defining moments. And it was, I always thought it was one of the most beautiful matches there ever was in wrestling. It was, the best thing about that match was the fans and the crowd. Everybody was so passionate about wrestling at that time. Wrestling was huge over here in the UK. I don't know if it ever got bigger. And I knew that the best thing about the Wembley match was that if it was going to be me and Bulldog in Wembley, and I didn't know for quite a while what the matchup was going to be. And I was the one that suggested Bulldog. And I know that there was two options, and I heard about it from Hacksaw Jim Duggan and Mr. Perfect, who were doing the commentary back in those days, and they said it's either going to be Wembley Stadium against the Bulldog, or it's going to be Washington Cap Center against somebody else. They didn't know who for sure. And so I thought about it, and I thought, well, I'm going to go in and suggest to Vince that if it's England, that it should be the Bulldog, and if it's the Washington Cap Center, it should be Shawn Michaels, because they had him in mind for me to work with. And lo and behold, I did eventually found out that I was working with Davey, and I told Vince when he first booked the match, I said, you better put us on last. I said, but nobody else will top it. I promised, I said, it'll be one of the greatest matches that you've ever seen, period. And I remember he came to me a few weeks later as the summer went on and said, I hope you can top it because you're on last. We changed the whole card to put you guys on last because he basically told me, he goes, I don't think anybody can top you guys, so we'll have to put you on last. And the funny thing about all that is I did have a rehearsal match with Davey before he got injured that summer, and it was probably about end of June or early July, but we knew we were wrestling at Wembley, and Vince threw us in just a match to see how well we could kind of click together and jive. And it's funny because I remember we went to the ring and we had just a shitty match. Just nothing came off right, and it was one of those TV tapings where a lot of things going on, a lot of distractions, and Davey just wasn't up to speed that day, nor I, and we had a really lousy match. And I remember walking back to the dressing room. I can remember Vince looking at me like, "It's going to get better than that, right?" And it's like, yeah, it'll get way better by. I said it's just an off night, and it was just an off night. But Wembley always stands out because I knew at the time that I knew I had a really strong following here in England. Like I would say, my following here in England was just every bit as strong as Davey's following, and maybe stronger. But it was pretty easy for me to understand that the way the storyline would go, that the British fans would have to back the British guy in the match, and that as much as fans loved me, they would go for Davey in the match. And at the same time, I also knew, I said, nobody knows much. It could go either way. Davey wasn't losing too many matches in those days, and you know, I was the champion, so I wasn't losing too many matches. And it had that nice question mark about, like, I don't know who, like when you really think about it, it's like, who's going to win? Maybe it'll be a disqualification or a count out or some kind of an exit where neither one of the baby faces loses any value. Like I could still win, and Davey's. There's lots of outcomes that you can put in place that protect both the wrestlers and keep them both strong. Like it could have been, but being on last. At the end of that show, you almost know that, okay, it's got to be a clear-cut decision for this last match. It won't be a count out or something. And I always thought, I knew months and months before the match ever happened. I said, the beauty about this match is no one knows what's going to happen. And so I could tell when me and Davey got face to face in the ring, you could feel it. I could feel it then. It's like, this place is alive, and everyone's like, this is the match I've been waiting all night for, because they don't know who's going to win. And when you have those kind of that kind of a backdrop for a match, you can't have anything but a great match. I don't think. But I know that for me, I plotted out in my head for 2 months exactly, move for move, every single thing I was going to do in that match. And when I showed up I tried calling Davey all summer, and I couldn't get a hold of him. He got injured in about middle of July and went home with some kind of injury or supposed injury. I never know if it was a legit injury or not, but I personally think Davey was in the midst of a serious drug problem back in those days, and I think he went home and wasted away for about 6-7 weeks and pretended he was hurt and did a lot of drugs when he was home and was not. He showed up in Wembley and he was, just to be honest, he was not prepared. He was out of shape a little bit. He was super paranoid and really panicked. And I saw him the night before the show, and there's an interview in that SummerSlam that shows just before the match, and it's got me talking about Windsor Castle and all that stuff. But that interview was actually done on Saturday night in the Wembley Stadium, and was done as a pre-tape, and we just taped it that night, and they played it just before the match like it just happened. But it was on that Saturday night in the dressing room in Wembley Stadium that Davey came to me, and basically, because I called him, I said, "Why didn't you answer my calls all summer? I've been calling you every day." And he's like, and he just kind of broke down and confessed to me that he fucked up, and he was not ready, and he was really scared that he was going to screw up everything the next day. And he was very he was very afraid of what was going to happen. And I remember I told Davey, I said, "Davey, you're going to have to just trust me. Trust everything I say and everything I do, and just trust me, and I'll help you. I'll carry you all the way through this match, and I'll make sure that we get this whole story of mine is going to come out, whether you like it or not. We're going to do this thing my way, and you're going to be a great champion tomorrow, whether you know it or not." And you're going to have to follow my storyline here. And giving Davey all his credit, I mean, he did show up the next day and he listened to every word I said, and we had this great match. But I know that for me, that match was just such a great match. I know that you know, fans here in England that were there for it. Whenever I see fans that say I was at Wembley, I always go, "Where were you sitting?" Like, I hope you had a good seat, because that was maybe one of the greatest matches of all time. And I couldn't have given more or spent more from my body that night. Probably that and the Iron Man match were the two hardest matches I ever had, but I know I gave it all. And the hardest part of the match was carrying Davey for 45 minutes. I can remember the very first sequence of moves that me and Davey and I had done in the ring. It was only about 2 minutes into the match that Davey gasped up to me that he was fucked. He forgot everything. He forgot every single thing I told him at about the 2-minute mark. He was blank and panicking. And I can remember, if you never see Bret Hart, or very rarely anyway, see Bret Hart talking in his matches like so many of these guys today, that are always whispering right in each other's ear and talking to each other and telling each other what to do. And I hate that. That's a fail, automatic, lousy wrestler. Should be demoted to the first match for even being caught doing that kind of stuff. But that match in Wembley was one of the only matches where you do catch me communicating with Davey constantly through the match to tell him what to do next and tell him what to do next. And I did, and Davey followed everything to a T. But it was a beautiful match and a beautiful story, and you know, I never forget it. I never forget the fans that were there, and I wish I could have been like you, some of you, and sat in the crowd and watched that match.
I guess it was the situation that he was in, and therefore the action that you had to take, that probably gives you that added satisfaction that it was such a great night, in spite of.
Well, you know, I give Davey credit. I don't mean to make people think less of Davey, because Davey gave it all that day, and if anything, he rose to the occasion and sucked it up and delivered a better match than he ever dreamed he'd pull together. But for a long time, even after that night, Davey never really thanked me for the match. He never ever said, "Hey, you know, I know you saved my ass that night." And but he kind of seemed to forget the next day that any of that even happened. And you know, I never really felt that he showed much gratitude for everything I did for him that day. And then it was quite a few years later that he did tell me. He told me exactly what I just told you, that he was completely screwed that day and he had nothing, and that I carried him all the way through, and he thanked me, said that was all your match, and you know, he thanked me for it, and so I know that it was appreciated.
Brilliant, brilliant. Next name that comes to mind, Jerry Lawler. I know there's a story or two there, isn't there, Bret?
Jerry Lawler. You know, I loved working with Jerry Lawler. I didn't at the onset when we first started working. Jerry, if you remember, I won the King of the Ring. I had 3 really hard matches. The one with Bam Bam was really quite a long day at the office. And I really did sort of crawl back to the dressing room. I was in a lot of agony that night, but what happened to me before, after the match with Bam Bam, when I won the King of the Ring, Jerry Lawler attacked me, if you remember, and picked up that big wooden throne that was there as a prop, but it weighed about, I don't know, 150 pounds, that chair or something. It was a big, heavy chair. Jerry proceeded to pick that big chair up and try to, I don't know, he thought it was balsa wood or what, but he smashed it all over top of me, and I think he dropped it on my hand even. And anyway, I was in a lot of pain from the throne being dropped on my back, and then even after that, Jerry Lawler picked that scepter up and thought that would break over my back like a toothpick or something, and instead he's about killed me with that thing, and it hurt me for months, maybe 3 or 4 months, to take a deep breath. I couldn't even take a deep breath because I was in a lot of pain from that. But so that was the beginning of our setup for working with each other down the road, and I was going to get even with Jerry Lawler. I was going to fix him good when I saw him at SummerSlam for real. And I didn't say anything to him. I never mentioned to him that, hey, that scepter hurt a lot, and you're going to pay for it. Or I just kept my thoughts to myself, but I waited. And sometime that summer, I don't know what it was, but he was in some kind of a situation with, I was in a match with Owen, and I just know that Jerry Lawler came out and did something, and he ended up splitting Owen's head open in an accident. It was totally an accident, but he was pretty reckless, I thought, at the time, with some of the props, like the scepter, the throne, and whatever it was he used on Owen. So he had another big receipt coming for what he did to Owen, too. And then I got to wrestle at SummerSlam, and it was like I was going to take out all my frustrations out on Jerry and take out all those months of being in pain. And Jerry had no idea that I was fixing to get even in this match. And if you ever watch that match, Jerry decides that he'd come in the ring and wrap that crutch around my face, which was like the cherry on the cake. Like if you thought he was going to get, if thought I was mad before that, I was like really mad, because that almost busted my face open really bad. If you thought that was real, or a prop crutch or balsa wood, it was a real crutch. It hurt like hell. And so if you ever watch that match, when Gorilla Monsoon gave us the green light and said that I could wrestle Jerry Lawler, or he had to wrestle me, and that he couldn't get out of it. Every punch, when I fought Jerry back to the ring, was real. It was right in the face, and I was beating the crap out of him. And Jerry didn't know what the hell was going on. But I remember at the very end of the match when I put him in the sharpshooter, and we'd gone over this earlier in the night, he wanted me to just take it easy on him with the sharpshooter. I said, yeah, I'll put it on real easy, Jerry. And when I got in the ring with him, I knew, I said, the way to do this, and if you watch me, it's kind of fun to watch, because I put it on, I got it on kind of easy. I didn't put it on, I didn't kind of crank it. And Jerry's selling it and all that. And after about 10, 20 seconds, when he started getting tired, I'm cranking him up pretty good. That's when I kind of really cranked it. I kind of made the back of his boots touch the back of his head, and cranked on him big time. And he was giving me, if you ever watch, he's reaching up and giving me the office, or to tell me to let him out, and like enough, and I'm just grinning away, stretching him. But if you watch that, you'll even see the WWE agents come in the ring, and they're all trying to plead with me to let him go and all that, and they're all pushing on me and making me hurt him even more. And which always makes me think about Jerry. He had a lot of people that didn't like him for whatever reasons. I never worked for him, and I never wasn't around Jerry, so I didn't know him to not like him. Which reminds me of the first time Jerry, I remember when he first joined WWF, I remember he kept wandering around the dressing room, and he kept saying, have you seen my crown? And I was like, I didn't have the heart to tell him, like, yeah, I saw your crown. But so I kept telling him I didn't see it. It was in the shower, and I really don't know what wrestlers they were that violated Jerry's crown, but there was, I'm guessing, about 8 different wrestlers that pooped in his crown. I've always wondered about, like, trying to envision that, like, which guy, like, here's the crown, here's your turn, like, I don't know. I never saw anybody do it, but I know that it sat in the shower, about like you can imagine. And he's like, it was like about 3 feet away on the other side of the wall, and he's going, I can't find my crown anywhere. And I remember it was like I was getting changed in that room, and I remember kept waiting for him. He's going to find it sooner or later, and he did find it sooner or later, and he was stunned and mortified. And I think it started there, and they ribbed Jerry for a little while. A lot of guys ribbed Jerry, and he went through, through that whole thing. But in saying all those things, I loved Jerry Lawler and the matches he had. I love telling the story about my brother Owen, him coming to me one day and he's going, Jerry's going too strong, Jerry's talking about Dad having a heart attack, and that's too much, what if he does have a heart attack? And I'm like, And I remember I wasn't too worked up about it. He talked about Jerry, he'd say stuff about my mom putting her false teeth in and eating herself to death or something. He always had these little old people jokes. And my dad was older than the Dead Sea and all that kind of stuff. And Owen was the one that brought it to my attention that he was going a little too strong, and that was like, we need to talk to him and tell him to lighten up. And Owen kind of got me all worked up, and I was like, okay, we're going to talk to Jerry. First chance we see him, we're going to straighten him out and tell him, like, back off, lay off our parents. And it was funny because we came home from that, on that very trip. We came home, and we both, often when we first came home, we'd both drive up to my parents' house and visit them both at the same time, which is funny because we always pretended like we didn't talk to each other, and we kept that alive at the house. No matter who was there, we always pretended we weren't friends. But Owen showed up at my dad's house, and my mom and dad were watching WWE on TV in the afternoon, and there's Jerry Lawler and talking about my mom and dad and all these jokes. And I remember my mom was just laughing her head off, and oh, that Jerry Lawler, and she's on and on about Jerry Lawler, and my dad's laughing.